In 1660, the decision was taken to restore the monarchy that Oliver Cromwell had removed along with Charles I's head in 1649. And so the king, Charles II, he made as unlikely a political comeback as Nigel Farage when he came back to lead the Reform Party. Although, of course, that was less a return of the king and more return of the cunt. Charles was already the coronated King of Scots. The Scots had coronated Charles on New Year's Day in 1651 in an attempt to try and harbour national unity around this figure that everyone could get behind. Charles II was kind of like an Andy Murray character, whereas everyone in Scotland got behind him. In England, they kind of footed about hoping that Tim Henman might work out. Now, if you think that the Scots' commitment to Charles II meant that he looked on his northern kingdom preferably, you'd be wrong. Charles II, he absolutely despised Scotland, or more accurately, he despised Scottish Presbyterians, which was ironic because they had a photograph of him hanging up in their dressing room. When Charles was coronated in Scotland in 1651, he was a covenanted king. What that meant was he agreed to uphold the terms of the 1638 National Covenant protecting Presbyterianism in Scotland. Throughout his time in Scotland in 1650 and 1651, he was constantly berated and lectured by Presbyterian commissioners who told him that his family were pure evil and that his father, his grandfather, and his brother were some of the worst men to ever walk the earth. They'd constantly lecture him and, read other passages from Prince Harry's autobiography as well. In 1661, the Scottish Parliament restructured the Scottish Church so it was no longer a Presbyterian structure, it was an Episcopalian one, which at its most basic level basically meant that Charles reintroduced bishops to Scotland. Bishops that he chose, which meant that he could exert his influence over the church in Scotland. This is what the entire civil war in Scotland had started over in the first place. In Scotland, we take the separation of church and state very, very seriously. We do not believe that religion has any role in government whatsoever. We believe that religion should stay where it belongs, in Scottish football. A law was passed which stated that any Presbyterian minister appointed since 1649 had to swear an oath of allegiance to Charles II and renounce the National Covenant. Many Presbyterian ministers, particularly in the southwest of Scotland, refused to do this. They gave up their parishes and they took their congregations out into the hillsides and the fields and the barns of Scotland in illegal religious gatherings known as conventicles. The government, they sent soldiers out into the fields and hills of Scotland to break up these illegal religious gatherings. In November 1666, some soldiers were beating up an old farmer in Dalry in Dumfriesshire when four men who were part of a conventicle, they saw this and they overpowered the soldiers. Then, with the support of others in their conventicle, they overrun the garrison at Dumfries, and this would lead to a rising known in Scotland as the Pentland Rising. Around 700 men from the southwest of Scotland, none of them professional soldiers, and most of them farmers and labourers armed only with pitchforks and scythes, they decided to march on Edinburgh. As they marched for weeks through the miserable Scottish winter, their numbers dwindled, and eventually they made it to the south of Edinburgh, here to Rullion Green in the Pentland Hills, where they made a determined last stand against around 2,500 professional soldiers. The reprisals in the aftermath of the Pentland Rising were pretty brutal. There was public executions and hangings in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Ayr and Dumfries. Brutal, in fact, were the reprisals. It led to more support for the conventicles, and conventicles started to spring up around the country. It led to, in Scotland in the 1670s and 1680s, what was known as the Killing Time, a period of Scotland's history where the government put particular effort into putting down these illegal religious gatherings that were springing up around the kingdom.
There is a very off-the-beaten-track memorial to Rullion Green in the Pentland Hills. Bran and I visited on a pissing wet, freezing cold Tuesday in February where we were riddled with the flu to really kind of capture the essence of misery that goes hand in hand with Scottish Calvinism, especially when you're preaching it outdoors in wintertime.